everyone. It is episode 299 of This is Whole Life. I almost just said 15 with Andy, Randy, and Jeff. And that's been a while. It's been a while. So I don't know where that came from. I've got lots of paper. See, here's the problem. My laptop is broken. My new one is on order, but it's sometime I ordered it in December, and it's still sometime between March 1st and April 1st. So I've been reading from paper, and I'm a color-coded person when I do show notes. And so when I'm just, anyway, so that's probably where that came from. But this past week, we were back into a rise to Old Testament societal justice. And last week, I'll be honest, I thought, isn't that kind of like what we already talked about this week?
Was it?
In the same vein, but it was totally different. And the teaser you gave us at the end of last week's podcast episode gave me hope that it wouldn't be, and it wasn't. But after this week, I feel like we kind of, the messages with Bernie, and then as we've started we continue into Arise, and I feel like every week the bar gets raised a little bit. And not by huge amounts, but it's like this growing thing. And I'm like, if we keep going in this for a lot longer, we're going to get tired of climbing, aren't we?
You saying you need a little mental break, Randy? Is that what you're needing?
No. It's actually,
we can help you out.
It's been good. I'll say this. I have really appreciated the fact that every week there's been a ton of stuff to really like, you can't just go, well, that was a great message today, wasn't it? It sure was. Man, let's
go home and eat.
Right. I'm ready for lunch. And now we get in the car after church, and you're just thinking to yourself, what do I do with this? There's stuff to unpack here. It's not stuff that you can just let roll off the end of your tongue and into your ears and then go, wow, that was nice. So it's been a lot to digest in a good way. I think it's all been really challenging, but in a good way.
Good.
And this week, our text, I want to start off with our text. It was from Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 19. This is New Living Translation. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and Lord of lords. He is the great God, the mighty and awesome God, who shows no partiality and cannot be bribed. He ensures that orphans and widows receive justice. He shows love to the foreigners living among you and gives them food and clothing. So you too must show love to foreigners, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. You must fear the Lord your God and worship him and cling to him. Your oaths must be in his name alone. Why does this not sound like the Old Testament God of anger that so often is the go-to, or this is what, the Old Testament, that's the God of fire, that's the God of anger, that's the God of seemingly sometimes, like we talked briefly last week about a few cases where it really didn't seem like justice, seemed a little harsh to be turned into a pillar of salt and things like that. But this totally throws that completely on its head.
Does it?
I think it does.
I don't know.
Does it not? Am I looking at it?
I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I grew up in a different era than the current one. So I grew up in an era when you got spanked for things. I don't know how it was for the two of you, but I grew up in an era where the spare the rod, spoil the child was taken quite seriously and literally. There was nothing figurative about the rod.
No.
And so all I'm trying to say is that I have a wonderful father who I know deeply loves me. Mm-hmm. And I know who also disciplined me in a way that probably would make some people a little bit uncomfortable maybe today. And I'm, again, not here to have a debate on the right way to punish your children at all. But what I am here to say is that for me, there is no difference between the father that gave me some pretty vividly memorable spankings and the father that loved me.
Yeah.
And has always been there for me and who's cared about me. And so I think that's sometimes a little bit of a mistake to think that somehow you being loving means that you are weak or that you don't defend right and wrong, and that you don't stand up for what's right. So at the same time, I think that there are those who really get a lot of joy out of a God that's kind of capricious in his in what he does, and kind of takes gleeful joy in creating suffering and pain in those who have annoyed him. And that was, one of the things I appreciate about my dad that I think is very different than a lot of other people's experience with parents that gave them corporal punishment. And that's that my dad never, ever spanked me when he was angry. If he was angry, he wouldn't spank me. He would not do it. He would wait until he'd calm down, because my dad truly believed again, right or wrong, my dad truly believed that spanking was there for a purpose and a point, and it was to help me to remember the kind of action. It was not to get even with me. It was not a way for him to blow the steam off of being angry. And so that's why I say, when we look at the Old Testament, or we kind of sometimes want to clear away the God that does things that make us uncomfortable and just kind of ignore that in favor of the God that we like, that's kind of the verse that we just read. But again, I think it's possible to be loving and to do some difficult things. And when I look at the Old Testament, I see a God dealing with 3 and 4-year-olds, and 3 and 4-year-olds need more concrete information, if you will. And the other thing that I see about that is that, so that's why I don't think God changes. He's the same loving God. He doesn't, Jonah says it. I know that you don't want to destroy anybody.
Right, yeah.
But God does do some things that are difficult out of love. And so as we look at the difficult things, for me, that's always the place that I look at. There's a couple of questions I ask when I see difficult things. Number one, is that God acting, or is that human beings acting, saying that they're doing it in God's name versus God really asking? And there's several places that there's some terrible things happen that we attribute to God, but when you read it carefully, it doesn't say God ever told them to do that. They just kind of went out and said, well, that's what you want me to do, God.
Did it. Yeah.
And then the other thing is that when I do see some things where I see God saying this needs to be done, I ask myself, how could a loving God do that? And sometimes I got to be honest with you, there's some places where I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But there's other places where I see it and I go, oh, I can see why you would do that.
Okay, hold on. Two questions. So is it more, do you think, a perception of, and maybe, Jeff, this is for you, is it more of a perception of maybe how we were raised and maybe how discipline worked in our time? Maybe people today that are raised, we were just talking about this with my parents the other night. I got spanked quite a bit early on, and then it just didn't do any good, so I didn't, You
and my brother are the same. It frustrated me to death because my dad would spank me. He wouldn't spank my brother. It does no good with your brother. I'm like, what do I have to do to prove that does no good?
And my brother would get it because, I did something and he was supposed to know better and we weren't supposed to do it. And he was supposed to keep me on the straight and narrow, which, proved impossible. So maybe is it a bit of a perception of maybe how we were raised or how we were disciplined that we might have a different view than what you're saying? Because I like what you're saying, that your dad took this cooling off period and it was really to teach a lesson. It was pretty pure in that way, whether you agree with spanking or you don't. And then second, if these things that we can't explain and we see them, do you think there's more or less of those than we think there are? Because it all gets clumped in. Always what I hear is the Old Testament God, ooh, you just didn't want to mess with him. Now the New Testament God, he was, that guy I like. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's a little perception. Maybe it's, or are we just missing it and we're clumping everything together when in reality there's a lot of stories, like you said, nobody told them to do this. Why do we blame God for this?
Following along with Ken's analogy of working with 3 and 4-year-olds, when you're a kid and you go through a trying time, say for instance with a parent, you ask that child at that time how they relate to their parents at that time. They're not going to give you a real beautiful kind of warm, heartfelt answer. They're going to be in the mood. And sometimes I think we look at this from the standpoint, like Ken mentioned, we look at it from the standpoint of these are, and I hate to use this word, but these are implied understandings sometimes by people who see God their way and understand him in their context. We had a theologian she was from Andrews, came a couple of years ago, and she talked about this implied versus preferred voice of God. And it was a beautiful understanding of the Old Testament. I think Ken's right. I I believe the same way, that the Old Testament gets a bad rap on these things when we all of a sudden take one picture and say, that's the God of the Old Testament. Well, actually, there's a whole lot of other great pictures that might completely differ from that.
Yeah. I don't disagree necessarily. But I know there was a time in my life that if you'd asked me the same question, I would have given you that same answer. That God of the Old Testament, very different than the God of the New Testament.
Absolutely.
So, and maybe it's just where we are in our journey. But I guess
I want to really touch back on what Jeff said, because I think that's really brilliant. You ask a 3-year-old to describe their parent, you're going to get a different description than an 18-year-old.
Oh, yeah.
And so especially you're going to get a different answer from a 3-year-old that's just been disciplined. Mm-hmm. And they're going to view the rest of the world through that lens. And so I guess that's where I feel like it's worth kind of considering that the Bible, sometimes we have this impression that God just wrote it out and then handed it to somebody, but that's not at all what happened. People wrote down their impressions of what God was doing and saying. And they were inspired by God. There's no doubt about that. The Bible, I totally affirm, I believe what Peter said, that all Scripture is God-breathed and worthwhile for instruction. It's all God-breathed. But I think it's important that Peter didn't say all Scripture has been handed directly from the hand and voice of God directly to people. And so this is an important thing, that people are putting their own fears, their own phobias, their own spin on things into what they're writing. And so as we experience God, I think when you look at New Testament writers, you're looking at more grown-up writing.
Okay.
You're looking at people who have a deeper understanding of who God is. There's literally more millennia of time that's gone by that they've had an opportunity to experience God. And so their understanding deepens. And you would hope that the same would be true today, that our experience is deeper as we see God's works and understand. Think about it. I mean, if you were an Israelite, there was no Bible.
Yeah.
All you had was the stories and traditions that you heard around the campfire. Today we have a Bible, that we have this scope of history that we can look at. And so, God was a little bit more concrete, a little bit more in your face. He had to be to get their attention to help them understand.
So would it be fair then, I don't want to call anybody a 3 to 5-year-old as they're disagreeing and saying that, well, I don't want you to think that that's what we're saying, that you're a 3 or 5-year-old if that's how you see the Old Testament God. But at the same time, is it fair then to say, just like you mentioned with the writers and where they were at, and there was a little bit of their own journey, their own spin in there. If that's your journey, and maybe the 3-year-old you and the 18-year-old you that got punished by people, maybe there wasn't a lot of difference in the results or in how you were treated, and so your answer may be closer to the same than it would be different. For someone that's in that place and they're maybe projecting a little bit of what they've gone through into those instances to see it more negatively, what can we say, or how can we help them move into a different picture without maybe spending the thing I always worry about is we spend long journeys around a lot of times away from God because this is my view, and it may not be the correct one. I mean, I saw that for a long time, and that's not my view of God now, but it was then. How do we help people take shorter distances around so that it's not like, wow, I wish I would have known that, 5 years ago, or I wish I would have realized what I was doing in my part, or what I didn't realize. I'm not sure what the answer is.
Well, I think the short answer is seeing Jesus, which is a really, that's the best thing about the Old Testament is, and I think the Old Testament is extremely important to have. We don't understand the New Testament without the Old Testament. And the Old Testament actually shows this same God now personified in Jesus. And so we get a chance. So that's the short answer, is that the quick way to understanding the Old Testament and the God of the Old Testament is look at the Gospels and see the life of Jesus. I think that just gives so much insight into that. The other side of that is that people in the Old Testament were using narratives and stories, and And we read in the New Testament, you see more what we would call today as exegetical theology, where we take things and we make concepts from them. And Paul was a good theologian and so forth. But there's theology in the Old Testament too.
Right, yeah.
And so I think it's taking these stories, these narratives that get played out, and then looking at God through that lens, and that maybe this is a long play, but realizing what it does to you in your own life in terms of looking at the 3-year-old versus the 18. Actually, to be honest with you, I would say 21 to 22-year-olds because I didn't really understand the commitment my dad had to me and to our family until much later on, realizing those things I complained about were actually his commitment to keeping our family together. And, he worked long hours, and I blamed him for that, and it took me a while to understand that. So I think understanding it in the context of our own experience.
But maybe that's why things even take longer today because, you and I don't know, maybe Ken too, I don't know when did you join the workforce? We all joined the workforce. I got my first job outside the house when I was 12. I rode my 10-speed to a produce farm. If you start families, people are starting families younger now, and maybe you don't see some of those, like you just said, in your family dynamics. Once you start becoming the breadwinner and you start paying for everything and you start realizing what it takes to put together, hold everybody together, you get a different view. Maybe that's part
when
of
you
it.
realize the world doesn't revolve around you.
I think the other thing I just encourage people, because I want to go back to what you said about, well, how do you help somebody who maybe has a younger view? I think it's important. My wife is an early childhood educator, so I get a lot of – I feel like I worked when she got her master's degree.
You did too?
I feel like I deserved not the degree itself, but maybe the degree light or something, because I got to hear a lot about – but one of the key phrases in early childhood development, one of the key phrases is developmentally appropriate practice.
Okay.
And one of the things that I think is important in our Christian life, a 3-year-old is not better than an 18-year-old. An 18-year-old is not better than a 3-year-old. The point is not a 3-year-old acting like an 18-year-old would be concerning. It would be. It would be very concerning. They need to be where they're at for their own development. And so a big thing in early childhood education is not to force a child to do something before they're developmentally ready
to
for
do
that.
It, yeah.
And so one of the things I just say is that if you're struggling with some of these things, wherever you're at in your walk with Jesus, if you're just beginning it, you're not worse than anybody. You're where you're supposed to be. You are, if you're just finding out about Jesus, if you've only known Jesus for a year, you might see some people that are doing things and you're like, oh, I wish I was doing that. But it's not about what other people are doing. It's about you. It's about where you're at. And you're not wrong to be where you're at. And so my advice is if there's things you don't understand, lean into it. Don't let it discourage you. Don't give up, but lean into the hurt. Lean into the confusion and believe that there must be an answer and that there is healing out there when you don't understand things in the Bible, and give God time to allow you to grow at his pace, at the pace that's best for you. And don't worry about it. And then for those who are at a different place developmentally, don't look back at somebody who isn't at the same place you are. And we sometimes make this mistake of looking at people based on their chronological age and saying, well, you should be at this place spiritually, developmentally. Well, no, you're not. We don't know your story.
Yeah.
We don't know what you went through. And so again, when we say 3 or 4-year-olds, that's not an insult. That's not somebody. The Israelites back then, of course, that's where they were at. It wasn't, they did not have what we have. So how could they? They had not heard the story of Christ dying and living. They had none of that. So how possibly could they have been any other way? And so that's the point I want to make. I think we just have to be really, I think we have to be careful about putting labels on others, and I think we have to be careful about putting labels on ourselves. We are where we are, and let Jesus grow us up. Let Jesus grow us at his pace and his way and his time, and I'm confident that God will do that.
That's good. What's nice about that piece is the fact that love, acceptance, and forgiveness can happen at all those stages.
The values stay the same.
Yeah.
Your understanding of them grows.
Yep. I really like Jeff. I agree. I like that because what immediately triggered in my head when you said, you need to be where you are and you need to be where you are. And honestly, the reason I think I never had, or I had such a negative experience was, Jeff, what you said, until you know Jesus, until you understand. And I had never seen a picture of Jesus that enticed me. Honestly, we did Sabbath school. We did great, first grade through academy, through graduation. And never did I see anyone that was just like, man, I am so happy because of Jesus in my life. And I'm not saying there weren't people there, and part of that was attitude, and there's a lot that goes into it. But it wasn't until I met Heather that I really saw in her, I was like, wait, here's a single person who's in their 20s who comes to church by themselves with a Bible. They sit and they're listening, they're reading, and I'm like, why? I mean, I would just sit there and ask myself, why would anybody do this? I don't understand. Like, I come to church once a month to run the AV system because they asked me to do it and twist my arm every year. And that was the extent of it. And it was nothing about Jesus or anything else, and maybe see a few friends. But that was the first picture of Jesus that I got that made me go, this might be something I need. And then very soon after that, it was, this is life changing. So that's maybe the best advice we could give today on someone just struggling with that other picture. But maybe the next best thing, I really liked how you brought in the code of Hammurabi. I know last year Ellie was learning that in homeschool, and we went through it as kids, but never to put those two together. It's like, well, this is a piece of history and this is a piece of history, but to actually put the two together, and then you realize that if you're saying that God is unjust, well, look at how much more the world is just not even unjust, but just crazy in comparison between the two. And I thought that maybe out of anything I've heard of, every time you think about, well, God is, his laws are pretty punitive and they're pretty restrictive and they're not really great. These laws are amazing in comparison. And even in Deuteronomy, that's a great list of things we could all strive. I mean, just even if you were not a Christian, just things you could strive for to be a great person in today's society. Even if you just looked at that.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think God ever created any laws he didn't believe in?
No, I don't. Why would he?
It's a good question.
I think he did.
Yeah.
Oh, did he?
Because of the context of culture and the place that he has to live in, or he has to.
I see what you're
I can actually give you an exact example.
Okay.
Jesus says it. I think it was the Sadducees were giving Jesus a hard time about this woman who had 7 husbands. Because according to the Levitical law, if a woman married a man and that man died without having children, then she was to marry the next oldest brother, and then he was to sleep with her, have children with her, and then his older brother's name would go on. Well, in this particular scenario that Sadducees throw out, maybe I'm getting my stories a little bit mixed up here. But anyway, basically, the woman has no children. But anyway, the point is, so yeah, I am getting it. Basically, they ask him, does the law permit divorce, basically?
Right.
And Jesus basically says, yeah, it does, but it wasn't what God wanted. It's because of your hard hearts that God made that law. And basically what was happening from my vantage point is God said, if I don't do this law, these women are going to be completely unprotected. I've got to do something that I don't like to do for a good. And so I think that sometimes one of those, I think, again, slavery is another one of those things that you're going to come across in the Old Testament that I don't think God liked it. I don't think God wanted it. I don't think God had, but he had to work within with the hard hearts that he had to work with to do as good as he could for people and hopefully progress people away from those sort of things. So yeah, and I think that's one of the big mistakes when we try to go all literalist and say, I believe everything in the Bible is exactly the way that God wanted it. Well, I don't. Then we should be doing a lot of things that we're not doing right now.
The thing that I thought about when you just said that was when obviously these rules, if you stop and think about it, and I was immediately thinking 10 Commandments, so I was thinking way too narrow. And I don't think any of those maybe were, but if you think about the time and the place, these rules were made after sin. We don't have a 10 Commandments or a best of practices from God from the Garden of Eden when everything was perfect necessarily as a how to live in society. And maybe it wasn't needed, or obvious. Well, who knows? Doesn't necessarily say one way or the other.
It's an interesting thing that we don't get a written law officially until Moses is handed to Moses, and yet there were rules, and the Bible says that people were held accountable for those laws that God had, that they were obvious in nature. And when it comes down to it, when Jesus says there really are two laws, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself, it really comes down to those two things. And when you start looking at the law that God hands out in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, I think you're looking at a law that God's saying, I don't think God thought it was perfect. I think it was as perfect as it could be for the imperfect human beings that it was there to try to be there for.
Well, and that makes perfect sense. I really like how we're
and you could say the same thing about the idea of having a king. God didn't want really to have him have a king.
Yeah, that's true.
He allowed it, and you could say that God put that king in place, so to speak.
So much of the message this week, I just really thought put just things in front of you to make you think that if you were one of these people, and again, it just resonated with me because that was me for a long time, that would have just said totally the two different gods and all that. It just kept putting things in front of you to think of and go, oh, well, if you think about it that way, and it really does give you a different picture of maybe what you believe about God and the Old Testament God for sure. The thing that really kind of struck me was in that verse, it's talking about the treatment of the poor, the foreigners, the refugees, the widows, the orphans, and the slaves. And the Bible says that the poor will always be among you. So I'm assuming that, we can kind of clump all of these were in the poor.
Jesus says that, but there's an interesting text that I did not include this week that I think it's Leviticus, where it says there should be no poor among you. If you follow these laws, there should be no poor among you.
So if we do what you're...
And then 2 chapters later, it says you will always have poor among you. But, which again, I think is going to God saying, if you did exactly what I said, there will be no poor, but I know you're not going to be, so there's always going to be poor, so make sure you treat them well.
So that was really my question. I mean, he's really given us the resources and the guide to say there should really be none of this here, but we just like back then, we just haven't done our part. We just haven't followed through. We just don't have it somehow in us to do all of this.
You would think heaven would be at the perfect place, and yet still here we have this story of somebody who became selfish or somebody who became self-centered. I do think that there is beauty in what God gives us and suggests, but he's not certainly naive to understand who we are.
And to think that we're going to...
And that's why forgiveness.
And I think it's not... And by the way, Randy, I don't think it's just... I think that there will be poor not just because there are ungenerous people. I think that there will always be poor because there will always be people, whether they are there are times where you try to help a person and they just won't take the help. They just won't. True. And again, that goes back to God's law. When you look at the law, it was a two-way street. When he said there should be no poor among you, there should be if everyone does what the law says, there should be no poor, and that's both on the side of the rich and those with less resources. If you have less resources, if you do what the law says, you shouldn't be poor. And if you're rich, you shouldn't be just tolerating going, well, they're poor, they deserve what they get. So we have a responsibility on both sides of that.
Yeah, no, that's true. And that's often unpopular, though.
Yeah.
As an idea that there are certain people that we've met. Our old church service, we kind of adopted this homeless guy, and we were like, hey, we are going to just support him. We don't know what that looks like. And at the end of the day, he's like, man, you guys are awesome. I haven't seen him in a long time. I think he moved back over to the coast last time I saw him. And he was just like, you know what? I'm just happy where I'm at. There's things about society I don't like and I don't want to be a part of, and I'm okay. And that was hard for us to understand. Like, what do you mean you're okay? You sleep in a tent and you've been robbed, you've been beaten, you've been harassed by police. And he's like, but I just want to be where I'm at. So I think that doesn't register with us very well sometimes, but I also really enjoyed, I'm glad you teased, because Heather was getting up and Emily was getting a little restless and she was going to get up and I'm like,
there's a lot of Bible verses.
And I'm like,
I don't know if I've crammed that many Bible verses into a sermon.
It was good.
And
though.
I was so worried about that. I was like, I want to show all the cool things that God is doing, but my goodness, that is a lot of Bible verses to read through.
But
so I was afraid it was going to be a little dry.
I think it went through well. And I also think, that's the other two-way street. You can present, and just because we can't get it all in 25 minutes or whatever we have, that's on us to go back and double check and make sure Ken's work is right.
Absolutely.
So and Heather kind of stood up and I'm like, no, don't miss this part. This is really cool. Ken teased it on the podcast and I know she doesn't listen. So I knew she would have missed it. But when you said how the Israelites were put in this place in the promised land because it was the center of everything, the center of all commerce and trade and the known world, and everything would have to go through there. So it wasn't just like, hey, this is my number one child and I'm going to give them everything and I'm just going to shoo everybody else away. But rather, and he also said, don't integrate, don't do that. But yet he gave them this opportunity, maybe the best evangelistic location in the world, to really just show people this is why you would choose me as a God. Do you think they realized what he was doing? I've never heard it explained. First off, like you said, like this like geographically, and this was a huge opportunity. Did they know that?
I don't think so. I don't think they completely understood it.
Completely.
I think that they, like most of us, when God hands us a blessing, we don't ask a whole lot of questions.
we like them.
It's like, oh yeah, promised land of milk and honey. That's great. Just we're not really worried about where that, as long as the milk and honey is flowing to us, we're not really as worried about where else it's flowing. And I don't know that their geography would have allowed them to really understand everything completely, their knowledge of it. Maybe it would have. I mean, I know that they had to have known that there are all these caravans coming through that area and through that region, but it really was. It was a major trade route in basically the known world. And when you think about how Christianity spread, as Christianity spread, it spread out of that area, and it just went crazy, and it reached not only the old world but the new world, the Americas. And you got to wonder what would have happened if Israel would have been more open to sharing and seeing them their responsibility as being outward focused as opposed to inward holiness. And that's, I think, for my friends out there, for those of you who are so obsessed with becoming perfect, and I'm glad that's the Holy Spirit's job, though. And what if we were more obsessed with sharing the good news with the world around us? I think we'd find that the holiness in our own life would increase.
Yep.
More than when we navel gaze all the time and stare and make accusations at our other brethren out there that, oh, you're a bad Christian, you're a bad Christian. Well, what if we were a little bit more focused on being the person that God's calling us to be, and then sharing the good news about what God's doing with the world around us? And I just got to think that if that had happened, that who knows how that good news would have reached the entire world, and how quickly it might have done that. We see even in Solomon's time that this Queen of Sheba comes to find out about what's making Israel so great. And one of the cool things is even that there's this kind of false narrative out there that Christianity is a white man's religion. And it's a false narrative because there are black Jews from that from that interaction that the Queen of Sheba had with King Solomon. There are black Jews, and there are also black Christians from a very, very early, from the very, very beginning of Christianity, that Africa, that there was parts of it that they were very much had Christian ideals because of the witness that happened in King David and King Solomon's time, and then the continued interest. You see Philip converting the Ethiopian eunuch who comes to Jerusalem because he's Jewish. And he comes to Jerusalem, and Philip actually converts him. He goes back, and there is a long-lasting and it's worth talking about during Black History Month that Christianity is not a white person's religion. It's a human. It is, those who are in the human family, that color has nothing to do with Christianity. Christianity is truly a religion for all.
Man, that's actually, when you stop and think about it, you hear about those pieces and you kind of forget about it. And you do hear every so often that there's this dynamic in Christianity tilting towards white. And it's good to hear those stories. Like you said, it just brings about more inclusion and brings up about a realization that Jesus was for everyone. And as I thought about the Israelites, and I'm like, after 40 years, none of the people that left Egypt got to go into the land of milk and honey, and all the rest of them, I think all they heard were the stories, and maybe just thought, maybe this is just a bunch of old wives' tales. I mean, what do we know for sure? And all of the bickering and just 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and you finally get there. I don't think my attitude would have been one of like, hey, let's invite the neighbors over. Let's make sure they get some. Oh, were they walking around in the desert for 40 years? No, we were. Yeah. So I don't think my attitude would have been maybe any better.
By the way, one other really cool, just since it's Black History Month, can we throw this out?
Absolutely.
A lot of Christians have heard of St. Augustine, right? He's probably considered one of the great early Christian theologians. And there are many credible people who theorize that he was actually Black.
Oh, okay. Really?
And that's
I didn't know that.
Yeah, most people don't, but there's based on where he's from. He was from North Africa, and so there's a relevant discussion that says that, and I think that's kind of a cool thing, because I think we all want to understand that where we've come from has contributed to the narrative, and I think that's one of the cool things that in my research that I came across. I thought, that's really kind of neat, because St. Augustine just had some really beautiful thoughts on Jesus and spirituality.
Well, and I'll just throw this in. I thought that Gail Murphy, anytime you can listen to Gail Murphy, and it's even more fun when you can participate with Gail Murphy and sing. And when she did, I think it was the second song this past week, and she said, we're going to get you to, it's called clapping your hands. We're going to put them together. We're going to go old time gospel on you. And you hear the differences, and maybe, we would have never heard gospel in Wisconsin growing up at church. And yet what a unique experience to hear someone else where that's their norm, and that they're just sharing it with you. And that was a really cool worship that we had.
Worship was so good.
It was very, very good. Yeah.
I think that's part of where we could land with this is the fact that our story is not about us.
Yeah.
Our story is not about what we have. Our story is about how we understand Jesus, and we get a chance to share that with others. That's the story of Hezekiah. How Hezekiah forgot who had truly made him when they came to visit.
The chat this week, Stanley did a great job. He asked some questions, and there was a lot of interacting going on with those that were watching online. And there was a lot of comments just thanking Ken just for the message and for where we've been over the last couple of weeks, and staff for having the insight to put this all together. And Ken, you made a comment. You said, we were created in the image of God. We most resemble God when we protect and care for the most vulnerable in our society.
That was good.
And I don't know who hears that. And who you watch the news, you listen to, radio, podcasts, media, each other, conversations that we have. And I feel like conversations that I hear around WholeLife Church are people that are excited when they hear about somebody else doing something really cool. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything or what we can tell someone. I know Trafina asked a question and we answered it during Q&A about where do we start? we've heard from Black History Month. We've heard from how we're dealing with the rules in society and our, aspirations. And sometimes it seems like we just kind of get stuck in neutral. We're looking for that good idea. We want to be creative because, like you said, we see creative people doing things, and we wonder, what do I do? Where does God want me? Or does the church have something for me that they're just waiting for someone to say, boy, I wish we had someone that would take X, Y, and Z up, and wouldn't that be great? What would you tell someone that's just on fire right now? Because I think if you have been sitting or watching online the last couple of weeks, you're thinking to yourself, I need to be doing more of this if I'm not already. And even if I am, I want to do more. I want to do something. What do we tell people?
First of all, I would say that they've already started.
Oh, okay.
Because that's really important, that they don't look at this as not starting. Because starting in this context is literally getting a heart and a passion and in a searching for that very piece. So don't think that you haven't started. Don't think you're at ground zero, because you were at ground zero before you came to that question. Then it is looking at those, first of all, that are around you, that are, we've always said this in our church. Let's not try to reinvent something that's already happening.
Yeah, for sure.
Enjoy the community that's around you that's actually already starting to do some of the things that you're passionate about. And then probably, my guess is the Holy Spirit will guide you into some pieces that maybe resonate more with your wheelhouse.
Now, Blackaby says that you should always look to see where God's working and then join him where he's already working.
Exactly.
I like that.
So to me, that's one. And then the other one is if God lays something on your heart, if there's something that you just are passionate about, you can feel it in your bones. See if there's some other people who can join in. I tend to think that God doesn't usually send us out solo. It's not that he never does, but I think usually he has other people that he lays a burden on their heart that's similar. So find those people and go for it. But those two things. Where's God already working? And is God calling you to something that isn't there?
And if someone has something on their heart and they're not sure where to go or who to look for, who do we send them to at the church that might be able to give them some direction?
I would just tell them to look for the pastor that's kind of within their area of passion.
Gotcha.
And if they're not sure who that pastor might be, they can reach out to Angela, our executive assistant at the church. You can kind of direct them. You can find me, any one of the pastors. You can say, hey, I've got this passion. Who's the right person to be talking to about it? And would be happy to direct them to the right person.
Excellent. All right. I really enjoyed this week's message, and not that I wasn't expecting to, but I just really thought that there were multiple things that, again, don't miss the message. If you did, swipe up in today's show notes. Speaking of Grace has the message up already. Go and listen to it, because there's a lot there to unpack. Listen to it more than once. I've listened to it, I think, 3 times now, and each time it was that fits here, that fits there, and it's a lot. Like Ken said, there was a lot of Bible text, and there was a lot to digest, but it was well worth the time to especially if you're just someone who's been thinking, I love God, but maybe, there's things that hold me back, and maybe it's my view, and I think you'll find a lot of really good pieces that you'll find there to just see this all in a little bit different light than you have before. So we only really had one question that we didn't get to. There was a lot of comments, and Ron asked, should we still look at the cross as a transaction? Blood for life versus life for life?
That's such a deep question.
It is.
That's a really smart person asking that question. I'm not sure if I'm as smart as the question. There's a part of me that says yes. There's a part of me that says no.
Okay.
So maybe the right answer for me would be I'm not sure. It's hard to say it's not transactional in some form or fashion.
Sure.
On the other hand, I believe that true love isn't about transactions, and that Christ's purchase of life isn't transactional. So I want to give it a little bit more thought, but maybe that'll be a good topic for some future sermons or something along those lines, because that's what a great question, what a deep question.
Well, it's hard to answer because there's so many different ways that it's put. as a transaction. I mean, you can go to a lot of different scriptures and make it look like it was transactional. But I think as we see Christ, I don't like the fact that we make it transactional.
You know, Jeff, it kind of reminds me of a story. I'm trying to remember where you told it. Maybe it was over the weekend somewhere. You were talking about you had a professor that you really respected a lot, and you were in his class on the theories of atonement.
Theories of atonement, yeah.
And you remember telling us about that?
He gave us 4 theories of the atonement, and at the end, I walked up, because it wasn't very satisfying class. I walked up to him, and I said, "So which one's right?" And he goes, "Take your pick." And he said, "All of them have holes in them."
Ow.
And man alive, that just rocked my world, changed everything. And it helped me understand that, God's so much bigger in terms of than our understanding can grasp.
Yeah.
God, man, he is so much bigger than even, I hate to say this, but he's even bigger than Christianity. He is a God who saves our world. He's the God of the universe, but he saves our world. And he can save Muslims. He can save Buddhists. He can save anybody.
Anybody he wants.
Yep.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we had a few comments just really quick. Morris said, "Finally, someone says it. Treat people right." Finally. And, that's always good to hear. It sounds trivial, someone saying to treat someone right, but I think if you don't say it, it also leaves it out there. Do I believe it? And so I appreciated that comment, and it made me smile a lot because I know that in Ken's heart, that's exactly what he feels too, is that, finally, let's treat everyone right. Let's just say it. Let's continue to say it. And let's say it until we get it right all the time. So that means I guess we're never going to stop saying it. And Heather had made a comment about thinking about the most vulnerable among us and think about children, adults, and disabilities and all the things that goes into it. And she says, in the body of Christ, things can be how we want them to be. And I pray that this is a place to start where I will start. And I thought, putting that into our prayer, maybe that's the most important thing we can do this week after we've heard and just digested this message, is that we just need some prayer for ourselves that this is where we want to start, and we want to start taking action on that. All right, so we are already over time, so let's just say that next week is 300. I think Ken mentioned something about going on a cruise, and for anyone that was that? No, the cruise. Where did I get cruise from?
I was thinking that, and then I was also just realizing that that this next Sabbath it's Elder
it's going to be Dana. I thought about that
Dana
too
Edmund
this morning.
Speaking. So should we just do the podcast at the church Sabbath afternoon?
If he has time, I would say
that's a good idea.
Let's go ahead and do that, and then we can do but the next one is March 5th, right?
Right.
I think we might just have to do a bonus episode and be like, hey, we did 300, we made it. Because I didn't want to – I'm looking forward myself to Dana's presentation. And I didn't want to
maybe we could do
lose any time on that.
We could do the presentation, though, or maybe we can do the podcast at the church live with people around and maybe we could figure out some sort of,
well, stay tuned. Yeah, stay tuned. We'll figure that out. And that was a suggestion someone did have. It's like, well, why can't we just come to the church and do it? And I said, well, I'm sure we could. And we can set that up. We do it at church retreat, so there's no reason we can't do it there. So stay tuned. And
maybe we can do it right after the seminar.
Oh, that would be fun. Yeah, we could do
this afternoon. So seminar starts at 3. Should be done by 4:30. 5.
Okay.
Then maybe we can do the seminar. We'll do a podcast for 30 minutes or so after.
Yeah.
Anybody who wants to hang out can watch it being done.
Yeah, we might even be able to just turn on the stream and just point a camera or two. That doesn't take a ton to do that.
I don't know. We'll see.
Are we going to stream that afternoon program?
We are.
Oh, well, then that'll already be set up.
Boom.
It'll be even easier. Look at Ken thinking on the go. So that'll do it for this week.
Just I hope buy a bunch of Snickers bars and bring them and throw them to the people who stay and watch.
That's right. Bring your favorite treat to share. Maybe we could do that. I personally I'm a fan of
almost as good as a cruise.
Almost.
Yeah, almost.
Pretty close.
Yes,
I will have to say that for 400.
I'm a personal fan of like homemade Rice Krispie treats, although that's probably not the best thing to eat while you're on the microphone.
Yeah.
Get stuck in your teeth, all that good stuff. No, probably not. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the message this week as much as I did, and I would encourage you again to go back and watch it at wholelife.church/live or catch it on Speaking of Grace, but it was just a message you're not going to want to miss. So stay tuned next week. Special guest Dana Edmond will do something in the afternoon, and hey, we haven't actually videotaped one of the podcasts since... wow, I think second season. So you could actually see it as well as hear it if that's your thing, or you can stop by and hang out and get your question asked right away. Don't wait for us to ask it. So that's going to do it for this week. Thank you as always for sharing the podcast and for your comments and your support, and we appreciate it. And just have a great rest of your week.